Welcome back. This is the second part of 1.5, Understanding External Influences on Business. The first part is business stakeholders, technology and business legislation in business. You'll need to have a look at the previous video for that. This video is just going to cover 1.5.4, the economy and business, and 1.5.5, external influences. So what is inflation? So it is measured using an index, e.g. the Consumer Prices Index, also known as CPI, which tracks how the price of a typical basket of items changes over time. The rate of inflation is usually stated as a percentage. So an annual inflation rate of 2% means that a product that was priced at £1 last year will now be priced at £1.02 this year. Ultimately, all it really is just comparing is what the price of goods are year on year. So the idea that when we used to say you can hide your money under your mattress, it doesn't really hold the same weight because the whole idea is that your money will always be worth less in the future. So ultimately what the CPI does is it takes a whole trolley of goods. So for example, you can buy, 20 items at Sainsbury, you go back in 1 year later. So let's say last year you paid, £55 for it, and the next year you pay £59. So the whole idea is that the cost for the exact same goods that you've purchased have gone up, and that is how they measure what inflation is. The impact of inflation on customers. So when we talk about impacts, remember to make note of these because these are the types of questions that you will see in your exams. So inflation reduces the purchasing power of money since money is now needed. Since more money is now needed to buy the same items. So high rates of inflation mean that unless income increases at the same rate, people are worse off. This leads to lower levels of consumer spending and a fall in sales for businesses. As people's pay doesn't go up as much as inflation does. So let's look at that for an example. So here we're looking at crisps. For the same packet in 2010, they were 45p, and in 2019, they were 67p. Doesn't seem like that big of an increase. So that's really not such a big deal. However, if we look at the same period, the national minimum wage increased by 25% in 2010 and 2019. So how does this compare to the percentage change in the price of crisps during the same period? The formula that we would use, so whenever we want to see the percentage price change, you look at the new price minus the old price divided by the old price times 100. So when we look at that, it takes that 67p minus 45p and then divided that by 45p times 100, which leaves us with 49%. So all of a sudden, 49%, that's nearly double 25%. So because the packet of crisps has increased at a faster pace than the national minimum wage, someone earning the minimum wage between 2010 and 2019 seen a reduction in their purchasing power. That is what purchasing power is. So it's reduced because the inflation has gone up higher than the amount of their wages. So it's just an important point to note, that's all. Now, the impact of inflation on business. To compensate for inflation, staff may ask for pay rises above the rate of inflation. This would lead to higher costs for businesses and could result in prices being increased further, adding to inflation. So what we're saying is, once we start to see inflation, so those packets of crisps in that previous example might have gone up, but then so many other things in the supermarket might also have gone up. So when your employees are doing their grocery shop, they've now got less money because of the price of everything's gone up. They've got less money to buy on their groceries. So what they're going to do is then they're going to ask their employers for more money to keep up with the level of inflation, or at least so that they've got more money to buy groceries for their families. But then what the employer needs to do is either will have to, because their costs will go up if they give the employers a pay rise. So they either need to accept a lower profit margin, or what's more likely going to happen is that they're going to put the price of those crisps up, and that price is going to be forwarded on to the customers. So basically, the inflation plus the pay rises is going to keep driving the price up, which in turn will still keep pushing inflation up. That's why we see these periods where inflation just keeps going up, because it's really hard for the market to balance itself out. So inflation also affects the global businesses that trade overseas. If inflation is higher in the UK than elsewhere, then the UK's goods become comparatively more expensive. This leads to a fall in the demand for the UK's goods. So each of the following are likely impact of inflation on business. To keep these as ideas for impact questions. So businesses will have to pay more for their supplies and raw materials with higher inflation. Businesses will be uncertain about their future costs, so will struggle to plan. Businesses will have to pay to reprint price lists, menus, and update websites. So the idea, if you're a restaurant or a chain or something like that, you've got your set prices, it becomes a really expensive exercise to reprint all of your menus and so forth and everything again. Businesses will have to raise their prices to maintain their profit margins, and businesses will need to give their workers pay increases. So these are things that can happen with inflation on business. So interest rates. Ultimately, the interest rate is the idea. It is the cost of borrowing money and it's the reward for saving money. So somebody is generally receiving some form of interest when money has been exchanged. So as most businesses borrow money, they're generally paying somebody else for the ability to have borrowed that money. But same, if you invest your money in a savings account, you are rewarded from the bank. The bank gives you interest as a means of rewarding you for putting your money there. Same thing as if you were to lend money out, that's the same thing, you would get your money back. So interest rates are set by the Bank of England in the UK. And ultimately, so if a business has savings, what kind of interest rate would they prefer? If you've got savings, you generally want a higher interest rate. If you've got borrowing, so you've got a lot of debt, you want a lower interest rate. But ultimately, the economy sets where the interest rates are. So if the interest rates are high, it's high for both borrowing and lending. So generally, depending on where you've got more of your money is probably going to depend on where you would prefer that interest rate to be and so forth. Now, interest rates are usually stated as a percentage. So the rate reflects how much is earned or paid in interest. So for example, an interest rate of 4% would require £4 to be paid for every £100 borrowed, and alternatively, a saver would also receive £4 for every 100 that they invested. Now keep in mind, the sad reality of the economy is banks generally often have a higher interest rate for borrowing than they do for investing. And that becomes a point of contention why a lot of people question why don't banks give the full amount back for when people have invested or saving their money, why aren't they giving them more? Generally, the interest rates will still be higher than what they were, but they're generally not as high as what it is for what they charge for people borrowing. So on this slide, we're looking at the ideas. So these are important things that you look at for the relationship between. So if we first look at what happens with the increase in interest rates. So if you're saving money, you're going to receive more interest on your savings, and this will encourage you to spend less so that you can save more. So the idea is that the more you save at this point during high interest, the more money you're going to make in this period. So you're inspired not to spend as much. If you are a borrower, you're going to need to pay back more interest than what you were previously. So it's going to discourage people from borrowing, so people won't borrow as much money. But also, when your interest payments have increased, you've got less money to spend on other things. So that's also what's happening when you've borrowed. You've got less disposable income and less money of what you can do with. So we'll talk about businesses in a moment. But ultimately, you've got less things that you can do with the current money that you have because you're having to pay more back in interest. When you've got decreases in interest rates, you're going to receive less interest on your savings, but it'll also discourage you from saving. So the idea is that if you're not going to receive much money for investing your money in a savings account, you're going to be more inclined to spend more. And if you're borrowing money, you're going to have less money to pay back. So it inspires people to either take out more loans or things like that, or buy a new car or expand your business because the cost of borrowing that money is lower. Now, how this affects businesses. So many businesses borrow money. So most businesses have some level of debt that they borrow, and that's fine because it's a way that they can generate more money in the plans that they're going to be able to earn more money in the future. But when you've borrowed money, you're generally quite affected by any change in those interest rates, same way as individuals, but they're also affected by changes in consumer spending. So this occurs as a result of changes in interest rates. So the whole idea is if in the market, like I was talking before, if the interest rates have gone up, people have less money to spend, the businesses will often get hit twice as hard because not only are they having to pay more, they've got more expenses because of that increased interest rate, they've also got less people in the market who are probably willing to spend money at that time. My first question for you here, not an exam practice, but businesses that sell expensive luxury goods, such as new cars, are the most likely to be affected by changes in interest. Why? If you think about essential goods, what people actually need, people will always need food, so the food markets will generally be bought. Now, is the food product that you're selling something that there's lots of competition on, and are there cheaper alternatives? That could become a factor for you. But ultimately, if you've got a specialty good that people don't need but like to have, you're probably at a bigger risk during times of interest rate hikes. So why? When consumers have less to spend, they are more likely to need to finance these types of goods through borrowing. The most new cars are often bought through some level of finance, and as a result, they may sacrifice these purchases completely. You might determine you don't need a new car at this period, or you could find a cheaper alternative, like a second-hand car, or you might even opt for a cheaper brand. So moving on to taxes now, what does it pay for? Taxation. So the definition for taxation is the collection or payment of taxes by individuals and businesses to the government. So unfortunately, taxes are a reality of our day-to-day life. So in the last year, this slide is probably slightly outdated, but when this was done, so I think it's bigger than this now, it was £873 billion. I can't even fathom, like I can see what this is as a number, but the amount of money that actually is. So if you think about what does it actually pay for? So here are some examples of what your taxes pay for. You've got hospitals, schools, police, the Navy, the council, the army, you've got the fire and rescue service, people who maintain the roads, people who maintain the parks. Your taxes are paying for all of these. So taxes can be collected in a number of different ways. If you are to go on to do A-levels business, you're going to find that you'll actually look at it in a lot more detail, but ultimately it's understanding what the purpose of taxes are in society for your course here. So here's just an interesting quote. Nothing in this world is certain except death and taxes. So if you have a look at all of these ideas, just reading all of those through, there's only one there that doesn't have a tax associated with it for you. And that ultimately is being born. Everything else you are taxed on. When you die, you're taxed on how much you're leaving. When you work, when you drive your car, if you buy a drink, if you buy chocolates, there are taxes associated with everything. So here's an example of how income tax is calculated. So regardless of what your job is and how much you get paid per hour, if you earn in the tax year less than £12,570, you actually don't have to pay any income tax. So if any of your tax has been withheld in that period, you will get it all back at the end of the tax year. Once you move beyond that point, so for the amount that you earn that's between 12,571 to 50,270, you are taxed 20% on that. In the bracket above that, it's 40%. In the bracket over £150,000, you are taxed 45%. So obviously, that's a lot of money when you think about how much you're earning. Obviously, and the argument is that if people who earn more, they've got more, they can afford to pay more in taxes, but it also acts as a disincentive for people to earn more money. The more you earn, the more you have to pay the government. And a lot of, obviously, what the government also support are families with lower incomes and things like that to supplement their cost of living. That's where a lot of tax money goes to as well. So the impact of tax on businesses. So high taxes for individuals will lead to individuals having less spending money. So that's if they change that tax rate, or if you move into the next tax bracket, you may have less overall spending money to be spending the way that you would. That then also leads to consumer demand falls. So when consumers have less money, the demand for certain goods and services will drop. So different products will drop based on the fact that people have less money to earn. So what I'm trying to unpack for you here, this is like a BLT. If you were thinking about this in an exam context, unpacking your ideas of what things will lead to when you unpack them. So higher taxes for businesses, that can lead to businesses facing increased costs. So they have to pay the government more for the money that they earn. And that in turn, they have to increase prices or accept lower profits. So you can be unpacking those ideas of why that is the case. So moving on to obviously in changes in the economy, unemployment. So unemployment is when individuals do not have a job and are seeking employment. This is the definition. So you need to be eligible to have a job, So when you are actually basing your stats and figures about the unemployment rate, you have to meet this criteria. So if you've retired, you're not unemployed. If you're not legally allowed to work, you're not considered unemployed. So therefore, it doesn't really take into consideration everyone in the population, but ultimately you need to not have a job and you need to be seeking employment. So my example for you, I've got 4 people here. They all have each different scenario. You have to work out who here is actually unemployed. So person 1, I've decided that I'm too old to work. Once I turned 60, I couldn't retire fast enough. Now I relax all day. Person 2, when I was made redundant in my 40s, I decided it was a chance for something new. Now I'm doing a degree. Person 3, I lost my job 2 years ago. Ever since, I just can't keep anything. Still, I keep looking and applying. And number 4, my name is Alexandra Field. When I gave birth to my first child, I decided that I had to stay at home to care for him. So there's only one there that is actually unemployed, and that is person 3. They lost their job. They're still not working, but they're still looking and applying for jobs. So sometimes we saw, like during COVID, when people got furloughed, which basically meant they got to keep their jobs, they got paid basically to be at home, they weren't unemployed because they still had their jobs. And the government obviously paid a lot of money for a lot of companies to keep people employed. But also, when people who did lose their jobs and there weren't many jobs around in the market, people stopped looking and applying for jobs. So all of a sudden, the unemployment rate dropped, not because people had more jobs, but just because people gave up looking. So that's a clear distinction when you look at the definition for unemployment, remembering they've got to be seeking employment in order to be measured as part of the unemployment rate. This is just a graph here where we look at what are the trends that you can identify. So during times, so you can see some of those peaks there had nearly 12.5% unemployment, which is actually quite a large number when you look at the whole entire population. But ultimately, there's always a level of unemployment. The idea is that it stays quite low, that most people who are looking for a job have a job. So you can see that things do go in peaks and troughs. And obviously, if you compared this to times during like inflation rate hikes and interest rate hikes and things like that, you'll start to see correlations between these different economic activities. So when you've got unemployment, here are some possible ideas. So some of these can be argued positively and negatively, depending on whether you're the applicant or in a business. These are the types of ideas that you probably want to look at in BLTs, especially in your case studies, because you might start to look at what are some of the effects of different economic happenings inside different businesses. So it means that there's less demand, so less inflationary pressure. So if more people aren't earning as much money, there's not as much people with money to spend things in the market, so inflation can come down. There may have more demand because households have less disposable income. So certain products for essential items, there might be even more demand because people can't afford, people have to go for the cheapest items in order to sustain their living. They may have higher crime rates. So if a lot more people are out of a job, people obviously need to support their families. So we do see crime rise, but that will also mean that we need to spend more money on police. There may be less demand because households can't afford certain items. So this is obviously more luxury goods will have a lot less demand during unemployment. A benefit for businesses, you might have a bigger pool of individuals to choose from for a job. So when you have a job available, if there's a lot of unemployment, you might have a lot more applicants to choose from. So you might get a better candidate than if during lower unemployment. You're not going to have steady income. That could be both for a business and an individual. You can use the opportunity of being unemployed to develop new skills. So some people, when they lose their job during redundancies and things like that in the economy, they often go back to university. I'm an example of that. You might receive less tax revenue, so the government will receive less taxes because less people are paying income tax. And also for you, if you're an applicant and you're going for a new job during times of unemployment, there's probably a lot more competition for that job. So you've really got to make sure that you are the best candidate for that. Okay, so consumer income. How will the level of consumer income, the amount of money that people earn, impact businesses? So we sort of started talking about that idea before when we looked at unemployment, of less people spending money because of different ideas. So what I wanted to do was break down, here's 5 examples. I want you to think of how, we'll come to how unemployment links to it, but if you think about the decisions people make between high incomes and low incomes. So consumers will be sensitive to prices. You'll be much more sensitive if you've got a lower income. So that basically means you might buy a particular good, but if the price of things go up, you're more likely to look for an alternative to maintain, to be able to still buy the same amount in that same economy. Consumers will buy more luxuries. If you've got high incomes, you're probably more likely to spend on lavish gifts for yourself and so forth. Consumers will try to save more. In your lower incomes, you'll try and save more, basically to be prepared for times of lower increase. And for consumers who don't worry about big purchases like cars and holidays, they're more people with higher incomes who don't have to worry about as much of that. So consumers might switch to cheaper companies or brands, generally if you've got lower incomes, because higher incomes generally can afford what they want. Saying that just because you've got a higher income, when other things are changing the economy or redundancies are happening, and you could foresee you might be losing some of your income, you might start to look for alternatives in the market to prepare for the future. So how does unemployment link to consumer income? Well, obviously looking about how much money you've got spending. Obviously you can get government handouts if you're unemployed and seeking work, but you only get a small amount. So that sort of puts you back into that lower income bracket. All right, let's do an exam practice question because we haven't done one for a while. So explain one benefit of high unemployment in an economy to a business. This is a 3-marker. Pause the video here and give this a practice. All right, let's push on. So economic activity is the amount of production taking place over time. The level of economic activity in a country tends to move up and down in a business cycle. But obviously as well, what we're going to look at in a moment, because economic activity, and we look at inflation, how the value of money tends to grow, we start to see, so the trend always moves. So this is an example of the business cycle. So all the green dots represent economic growth, the red triangles represent recession, and the yellow arrows indicate recovery. Come on. So in economic growth, we see an increasing national output. So that means that people basically are employed. The government is producing, not the government, the people of the country are producing more. That can be in services as well. So they're doing more tasks that generate more money. They might be producing more goods. And that could also be increasing a lot of their exports as well. So that's more money coming in to the country. A recession is the opposite of that, where everything is sort of fallen. People are losing jobs. People aren't producing as much money. People don't want services. People don't want goods. The recovery is where the recession has ended and the growth begins. So it takes a while to build up to those green circles, but ultimately, as long as things are moving in the right direction, that's the whole idea of how things will grow. So what are some of the things that we see during the economic growth? So we see the increasing national output, job security, pay increases, consumers feel confident to buy large items. So that could be like buying homes, buying cars, basically able to make big financial purchases are generally much more safer. Often we'll start to see interest rates lower, so people feel it's a good opportunity, while if interest rates are low, to make bigger purchases. Levels of borrowing are high, as I was just mentioning, and all types of businesses do well. So if people have a lot more money in the economy, we start to see people going out more for restaurants, buying holidays, building houses, building new businesses. And also we see a boom in businesses that supply other businesses. So it tends to be good for everyone during economic growth. Now, if we start to look at recession, so we see a falling national output, consumers don't feel as confident to make big purchases because they don't know what's happening. The borrowing decreases, often interest rates are going up at this point. Economic growth is negative for 2 successive quarters. So that is how you measure if there's a recession. You've got negative growth for 2 quarters within a financial year. We start to see businesses have finance and cash flow problems. Essential goods don't tend to decrease. So food, people are still need to buy food, but luxury goods and holidays and things like that will decrease. We'll see businesses closing down and unemployment tends to increase as well. So the recovery is, as you can imagine, it is ultimately from the recession that moves towards the economic growth. So we start to see the economic activity rise. So that basically means there might be some new ideas in the market, more production, more money slowly coming back in. And obviously that then has a flow-on effect. So consumer confidence increases, people are more willing to start making bigger purchases again. We start seeing the increase in spending, increase in borrowing, so often interest rates will come down to stimulate the recovery. So that's often what we saw like during COVID. The government brought the interest rates down so people will want to start spending money again. And that ultimately all feeds into the economic activity. People's jobs start getting, sales start increasing, new jobs are created. Companies that have roles that are like the nice to have roles rather than the essential roles. So people start to look at expanding their businesses again. Profit begins to grow, and ultimately the cycle then begins again. It can take a long time to get there though. So sometimes recovery can take a few years, but ultimately the idea is it eventually gets back there, and the business cycle is the whole idea. It's cyclical. So what goes up must come down at some point. All right, so we're having a look here at the exchange rates. So I want you to remember this acronym, SPICED. So the SP means strong pound. So when you hear this, think of the SPICED acronym, we're thinking of the value of the pound. So strong pound, imports cheaper, exports are dearer. So what that basically means, when the pound is strong, your money is worth more in other countries, which makes your imports cheaper. So essentially the definition of an exchange rate is one currency against the value of another currency. So the imports become cheaper, therefore the exports become dearer. So the downside of this, of having a really good economy, a good pound, is the fact that your exports, the cost of your goods. So when we see high, when inflation's driven the prices up of things, it makes it more expensive for countries that don't have as much money. So when the pound becomes stronger, other countries need more of their currency to buy the same item of goods. So a strong pound means that British people can buy more euros per pound. Foreign goods effectively become cheaper as we don't need as many pounds to buy those goods priced in a foreign currency, and our exports are now expensive. So foreigners need more of their currency to buy our goods in pounds. So the inverse, if you think about it now, if you flip that around, so as long as you remember SPICED, you can then remember weak pound will make your imports dearer. So it becomes more expensive to purchase things from overseas to bring them back, and your exports become cheaper. So that also will mean your domestic economy will be more affordable than buying things overseas. So that's actually a good thing to stimulate a local economy. So in this example, if we wanted to try and work out what we're basically going to get, I've got this example here. If you've got £1 and it's equal to $1.50 US, you're going to go on a holiday to California and you've got £780 and you want to know how much you're going to have to spend on your holiday. You literally take your £780 times that $1.50, so 1.5, which leaves you with $1,170 to spend on your holiday. All right, so practice question here. So there's actually two questions in this one. So the first question is, so ultimately, if £1 is equal to 164 Japanese yen, so this was actually the rate at April 2023. So how much would a product be in yen if the price tag was marked at £35? So you get 2 marks for this. Now you get another 2 marks for how many items priced at 5,248 yen can be purchased with £450. So pause the video here. You need to think, so I haven't given you a formula for the second one, but you need to think of how you're going to work that out using basic mathematics of how many items that you can buy. Now keep in mind when you do calculate that item, or how many items you can buy, you generally can't buy part items. So if you're buying mobile phones, you would buy 2 or 3 mobile phones. You wouldn't buy 2.8 mobile phones. So try and think of it, you need things in whole numbers. So generally round them down of how many you can buy. So you can pause the video here, and for everybody else, let's move on. 1.5.5, external influences. This is the last part of 1.5 and theme 1. So what external factors can affect businesses? The ones that the course focuses on are technological, economic, and legislation. So it leads to some of the items that we've talked about previously in this topic, but also to some of our previous topics as well. So in external changes, is it a crisis or an opportunity? They can be good and bad, or good or bad, depending on your business, but there's generally positives and negatives in all elements. Changes in technology create both opportunities and threats to a business. So opportunities include like developing technology will bring with it opportunities for new products or new uses for existing products. A business that can respond quickly can be first to market with a new product. So this is the idea when you change technology. So for example, if you go back to our Netflix example, um, they originally, so people used to go to video stores. Ultimately, then Netflix decided to take away the physical premise, and they used to they mailed out DVDs. So they changed the way that people hired movies for home entertainment. So you basically paid a subscription, and you were allowed to hire as many videos or DVDs as you want per month. They got mailed out to you, but you could only have 3 at home at a time. So they began to sort of undercut places like Blockbuster, who was the big conglomerate of the video rental market. And then ultimately they tried to merge with Blockbuster, and Blockbuster declined. Their opportunity then they saw as internet increased, so their technology increased, they basically realized that people could start to stream movies at home. So Netflix developed a whole new product as part of their service, and now they are one of the most recognized streaming services in the world. So they saw that opportunity as technology changed. They kept evolving their business model, kept being the first to do these things, or at least the biggest competitor to do these things. For a lot of other businesses, threats, new technology means that old products are likely to become obsolete. Remember those words because they are part of your core content for topic 1.1. Businesses that make these products could find themselves struggling unless they are able to respond to changes by developing new products. So what we saw back in the day, people would just have films they would put into their cameras, take photos on their holidays. They would then have to take that film to somewhere to have their photos developed, and would have to pay to have those pictures developed into hard copies. They weren't all digital. As we saw technology change in the late 90s, they started making digital cameras available for a lot of for personal use. So became a rising market for digital cameras, which then obviously put a lot of the old camera producers and the film providers out of business. What was then happening? Some of those people who'd done the old cameras started developing the digital cameras as well. As time has moved on, we've now had mobile phones where everyone's now got a camera in their pocket, which has now diminished the market for personal digital cameras. And a lot of people now don't even have photos printed, so they have the way people use pictures has changed over time as well. So that's been a threat to the businesses. Most of the companies who developed cameras and then digital cameras were not in the market for developing mobile phones. So a lot of them have kind of fallen out of the market now. So these are examples of what can happen with technology. So create opportunities and threats to businesses alike. Here's an example. The portable music industry is a good example of how changes in technology have had an impact on the businesses, even those that are household names. So back in the day, you had the Walkman, which were cassette players that you could play on you, so you could go for a walk. That's how it got that term. Then you had the Discman, which was an embellishment of the Walkman, but you could play CDs. That then turned into the development of MP3 players. I don't know that I'd put mobile phones there because I feel like although some people could listen to some music on their mobile phones, a lot of not until later phones did people start having the music on there. But basically from MP3 players, there came the iPod. Now, iPod wasn't first, but they became the biggest brand of the MP3 player world. Then iPod kept evolving their product. Ultimately, they came out with the smartphone. So, well, whether or not they were considered as the first smartphone, the way smartphones are today, Apple came out with um, the first iPhone, which was the first one that had the full, like the big screen and the touchpad. So they were quite innovative in that respect. And now, obviously, all smartphones tend to be MP3 players as well. And now we've got new products like the earbuds and things like that, where people are using that. So this is an example of how the technology has changed businesses in a whole industry. Now, businesses' responses to changes in legislation. So we're on to the next one of the subheadings here. Businesses have little control over changes in government legislation. They should, however, be notified of any changes in the legislation before they are implemented. During this period, they will need to respond by taking any necessary steps to ensure that they comply with the new rules. Failure to do so could have serious consequences. So this is what happens. So basically, a business has to comply with the law no matter what. They cannot claim that they didn't know. That is not a viable excuse. If you're in a business of a certain market, you need to know, it's your business to go and find out all the legislation relevant to that market. If you do not do it, you might experience penalties, such as fines. Some people are imprisoned. If you are doing something that is really misleading, or something to your negligence has affected other people's livelihoods. Bad legislation can often lead to bad publicity. So bad publicity can often lead to poor sales. So that's another thing that you need to be aware of, and that could be an idea that you would unpack in a BLT question. Some laws will affect all businesses, like things like minimum wage laws. It doesn't matter what your business is, you'll always have to pay your employees at least the minimum wage, but any changes in these laws will require a response. And then there are some laws that affect just certain industries other than others. This slide here is just some examples, so you can pause this here and have a read through them, but it's just talking about, so for example, the employment, we talked about the minimum wage laws. All businesses have to pay their staff more money if you're only paying minimum wage. There are a lot of businesses where you only need to pay the minimum wage for whatever reason. Consumer protection, so we talked about in the first half of 1.5 about all the consumer rights that people have, that you are basically entitled to be not lied to, you're entitled to get what you pay for. Health and safety laws affect people all the time. That can be things like just having certain signage around, having fire extinguishers in readily available places, things like that. All businesses have to comply with the health and safety laws. And tax. All businesses need to pay corporations tax if they are obviously incorporated. But basically, if you're a sole trader, you're only paying personal tax because you and the business are the same. But these are the ideas that everyone is going to have to pay tax. No one is exempt from these laws. So these are just some examples of what you can work with. The business's response to changes in the economic climate. So changes in the economic climate are usually characterized by changes in unemployment, so interest rates, exchange rates. What we're going to do, I'm going to show you some examples, but these are some examples. If you want to pause this slide here, just have a look at some of those details. They're a great way to sort of conceptualize these details a bit more, but I'm going to work through a worked example with you, because these are the types of things that you would need to unpack. So a few key points just to where we're at. So the number of ways that the government and the EU can make decisions that impact businesses. Things like minimum wage, maternity and paternity rights, so the ability of having children and being able to keep your job when you're expanding your family, health and safety regulations, environmental protection regulations. So these are, if you are a big factory and you might have waste or pollutions and things like that, there are laws and taxes on how that needs to be treated. And then obviously you've got taxation there as well. So everyone is subject to tax, as we've established earlier. So here is an example. So what is it, first of all? Minimum wage is the lowest wage to be paid to employees. So it's good for business because pay will increase. It motivates employees to work harder or to work more or to keep their jobs and so forth. Negatively impacts businesses because if you don't, so you're going to increase your costs when that minimum wage goes up. If you're only paying employees from the minimum wage, your expenses are going to go up. If you don't do it, you are going to be fined by the government. And if you are found not to be doing it, it will often end up in the media and it will develop a bad reputation, which then comes to the bad publicity. So some people might start to boycott your business. So maternity and paternity rights are rights provided to parents to give them time to maintain a family. Positive impacts, so people like it because they're treated with equality, they are shown respect for their life choices, motivated workers, and a good reputation. Now, negative impacts on a business, it's not a reason not to put people who are having families, but employees aren't in work for a period of time and they must be paid. Now, sometimes in smaller businesses, the government will actually pay that parental leave, so you're not going to be out of pocket for the person who's away. Saying that, they still need to be paid and that still needs to go through your company. But ultimately, you're going to have someone who's an experienced employee who's not going to be at work, and you are going to have to pay someone to do their job for them. Now, they may be not as good, so there might be some costs in this. These are some negative impacts with maternity and paternity rights. Health and safety regulation are laws to protect employees and customers. So what it can mean is a safer workplace, it reduces accidents and increases productivity. Obviously, if you don't have as many accidents, everything's going quite well, you're not going to be liable for anything. People are generally happier, or people know what's expected of them to make sure that they're safe, and you can feel better that obviously you are doing everything that you're doing to protect the lives of your employees, and in turn, you're protecting yourself from litigation. If you have a negative impact and there's been an issue with health and safety regulations, first of all, health and safety is expensive to implement. We talk about all the obligations that you have to comply with, and they can be quite expensive to have. And you also need to have all your safety equipment tested regularly and things like that, which is an added expense. And if there is an accident, even if you've done all of these things to mitigate the risk, if there is an accident, you are still responsible if something happens. That could mean you're having to pay out, you could be sued, and so forth. And that includes any guests into your workplace. So even if it's not someone who's your employee, but if you're running a supermarket and you might have thousands of people walking through your doors every day, someone who just walks into your place of business, if they have an accident in your business, you are liable for them as well. We talk about environment protection regulations, laws around waste management and emissions control. So these are good for a good reputation, and you might attract more ethical customers. Also remember that these laws are just stating the minimum that you have to do. Some companies try and go the extra mile so that they've got a really good reputation and good branding about doing good things to provide clean energy and things that are, environmentally friendly, organic, things like that. However, if something goes wrong as a business, you have to take responsibility for it. And especially bigger companies, they'll employ people specially to focus on environment protection regulations. And it's quite expensive. They're generally people with a specialist area of law. Sometimes it includes lawyers as well. And it's what they can do. So they spend a lot of money and time creating a more ethical business and so forth. So it can be still quite expensive to do, as well as having people to do it. Taxation is collected by the government on certain activities, which pays for all of the government spending. Good things is, well, it's the law. You don't really have a choice about taxation. The money that you pay in tax can be reinvested by the government. So sometimes you might be paying tax, but governments might also be giving grant. You might also be the recipient of a government grant, and that all comes from taxpayers' money. Bad impacts about taxes. So if taxes increase or things like that, or new taxes are brought out, it increases your costs. Consumers have less disposable income. So if taxes increase for your clients, they've got less money to spend in your business, but also for you, you've got less money to invest in new projects and things like that. All right, exam practice. Discuss how a business may react to changes in consumer legislation that make it more difficult to sell a product. This is a 6 marker. So you need 2 BLTs. Pause the video here, give yourself 6 to 7 minutes and have a practice with this. We've almost finished the content. Huzzah, we're here. All right, I'm just going to quickly go through the answers from this video. So the first one was explain one benefit of high unemployment in an economy to a business. So for 3 marks, one benefit is that recruitment may be easier for a business. This is because there are a large number of people looking for a job. Therefore, when a business is looking to recruit, there may be a large pool of potential candidates to select from, often with better qualification than in times of low unemployment. This increases the chance that the business gets the best person for the job. All right, so this was the numbers. So this is if £1 was equal to 164 yen, how much would product A be in yen if the price tag was marked at £35? So for 2 marks, ultimately you just had to take the £35 and times it by the 164 yen. So you get 1 mark if you actually put that into your equation. And ultimately, if you go through, you've got your calculator there, 5,740 yen is the correct answer for number 2. Now, the second question was how many items priced at 5,248 yen can be purchased with 450 pounds. So what you need to do first is put them into the same currency. You take your 450 pounds times your 164 yen, which leaves you with 73,800 yen. Now, because you're trying to work out how many of the items that are valued at 5,248, you basically take your 73,800, divide it by 5,248, and that leaves you with 14 purchases of that product can be made with 450 pounds. Now, I think the answer was actually like 14.2 something or 14.3 something. We just round that down because you can't have part items, so you can buy 14 full items for that amount. And the last question here was discuss how a business may react to changes in consumer legislation that make it more difficult to sell a product. So one response is to stop selling the product. As a result, they may have to spend money on researching and developing appropriate modifications or a brand new product. This may involve a business having to raise some finance to be able to fund the research. Consequently, the business may find itself in debt. Another response could be to enter new markets where there is less legislation on selling the product. This may involve retraining staff and/or moving production locations. This would likely prove costly. Therefore, it would still allow the business to continue to sell their product. So the idea is that you're coming up with an idea and you're unpacking it. Always aim to do a full BLT, so a full because leads to and therefore. This will maximize your chance to get full marks for those questions. Sometimes you can see those points are quite small, they're quite minor. You don't have to think about expanding it in huge detail. Like we talked about in the original content, avoid the word also because you're putting two of your ideas together. Separate as many ideas as you can so that your examiner can see that you really understand what the question is asking you. All right, that is the end of theme 1. You've got practice questions available for all 5 topics, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and 1.5 available for you. If you've got any questions, please contact me. Otherwise, good luck and we'll see you for theme 2.